Here at the Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give many of the talks. We have a planning meeting every quarter that's open to the whole community, where we consider suggestions for talks that members of our community would like to give. For today, please join me in welcoming Eva to give the talk on Good English, Prescriptivism, and Living Language. Woo!
Hello. So the topic of this talk is Good English, Linguistic Prescriptivism and Living Language. And in case you're not familiar with the word prescriptivism, I want to start off with that. It means saying how something should be, prescribing a correct way. It's the opposite of descriptive, which is cataloging the way things actually are. And I'd like to share a cartoon setting up the difference. Linguistic prescriptivists make terrible zoologists. And just in case you can't read that clearly, we have the guy is looking at a monkey and saying, actually, you're not in my book of animals, therefore you aren't a real animal. Looking at the tiger, subspecies, just a tiger that doesn't know how to be a proper tiger, so lazy. Looking at the armadillo, that's a mistake. Your species should only have 9 bands. Educate yourself. Looking at a moth, which has been changing color on sooty trees, stop evolving. All right, so this is actually a pretty good illustration of the absurdity of prescriptive linguistics or linguistic prescriptivism, because it's the position that there is a correct way to speak and write a particular language, and that deviations from that correct way are errors and inferior. Actual linguists in the modern day practice descriptivism. They record how people actually speak and write, catalog them by place and context, and the kinds of rules that they are using. You can derive the rules from the patterns of actual speech. Even if there are occasional actual errors, like someone didn't mean to say it that way. In the modern sense of linguistics, it would be nonsensical to say that a native speaker of English is constantly making recurring errors in how they speak English habitually. If they always say it that way, that is not a mistake. That is the way they speak English. It only makes sense to call it an error if you are comparing to a standard that is different. And that standard is good English, or what is more accurately and fairly called standard English. And today I'll be showing you how linguistic prescriptivism about English is laughably misguided and usually ends up in the service of classism, racism, and xenophobia rather than quality of communication. And I say this as someone who used to be a rabid prescriptive linguist as a younger person who was very proud of myself for understanding all these grammatical rules, reading all the books about how you aren't supposed to put prepositions at the ends of your sentences and things like that. So it turns out that a lot of those rules are really made up as shibboleths. They're ways to ensure that those kind of people don't get admitted into our circles. If you set up rules that only people who go to the right schools will know, then you can exclude others from access to lots of parts of society, like voting or getting into good schools or getting a good job or being listened to with letters to the editor. There are lots of ways you can reduce people's access if they don't talk right. So let's start off here with, what is English anyway? Well, English started as a language spoken by Germanic tribes in England, who were then conquered by the Norman French, who took over the nation, and they laid their own language over the top of the Anglo-Saxon or Old English. Later on, English people conquered most of the world, and they spread their language all over. They borrowed words from all the other languages for flowers and animals and arts and food that were in other places. In the Renaissance, English speakers turned to the classics. They went back to ancient Greek and Latin for words for arts and philosophy and religion and the new sciences. And Greek became more popular after the Protestant Reformation put Latin out of fashion, so we got a lot more Greek words in English. Because of all these layers and layers of languages that we've piled into English, English has by far the most difficult spelling of any language, because you have to know Anglo-Saxon rules and Latin rules and French rules and Greek rules and when to use what. And now somehow this preposterously complex bastard language has come to be spoken as a first language in many places in the world and as a second or third language in a surprising amount of the world. Ending up with English as the language that is spoken for business and so on is kind of an absurd outcome given how complex it is. So if that's English, well, what's good English? I'm going to go back into the history a little bit. Good English means English as spoken by the ruling class. Back in the 1070s or so, just after the Norman conquest, actually it was French. So only a peasant would call a cow a coo, which is how it used to be pronounced, instead of a boeuf, like the Norman royalty would be calling it. But over time, those Anglo-Saxon peasant words and the rulers' French words came to be spoken by the same speakers, and we just divided up that vocabulary so that the Anglo-Saxon words became the words for the everyday peasant things like animals and huts and things like that, and the French words became the words for the fancier or more processed things like meat and mansions. That newly melded language was Middle English, and it had lots and lots of nuance because it had twice as much vocabulary. Correct spelling hadn't yet been invented, so people would just puzzle out letters for how to spell things on the fly, maybe spell things 4 different ways on one page even. Middle English sounds familiar, but not quite understandable to most modern English speakers. Then we got early modern English. That's what Shakespeare wrote in. And it's still intelligible to modern readers, even though it's had some changes to vocabulary and pronunciation. Helps to have footnotes. Spelling was still a free-for-all, but because there was a printing press now, it was starting to get nailed down. And then as people created dictionaries in the 18th century, that really solidified spelling. In the United States, dictionary writers decided to respell some things to make us different from Britain. So that's why we have that bunch of changes. And by the way, at the same time, during the period from 1400 to 1700, vowel sounds in English were gradually shifting, rising higher in the mouth or turning into diphthongs. This is called the Great Vowel Shift. And the phonetics were changing just as the spelling was becoming standardized. So in a lot of cases, the spelling solidified and the sound kept changing, and we ended up with spellings that don't really match our sound anymore, which is why spelling in English doesn't match the vowel sounds in every other European language. In the 18th and especially in the late 19th century, lots and lots of grammatical rules started getting declared. This is when we got no splitting an infinitive, no ending a sentence with a preposition, no double negatives. Double negative means a positive. No use of singular they. And books were getting published laying out these rules, laying out the way to speak and write English correctly. A lot of these rules were modeled on Latin grammar because Latin was considered to be a really superior and very methodical language. So if we could just be more like Latin, that would be better. The thing is that a lot of these rules were, you can't do this in English because you can't do it in Latin. Well, in Latin, you can't split an infinitive because it's not made out of a to and a verb. It's just a verb form. You can't split it up. So to say you can't do it in English because you can't do it in Latin doesn't make any sense. It's not the same kind of verb form. And that was true for a lot of these rules, that it was simply something you couldn't do in Latin, but was perfectly possible and even common to do in English. And so some of these handbooks were saying, no, the way most people do it is wrong. That's bad English. And we're laying out the correct way to do it. And sometimes they were going back to a really old rule that had actually changed, a century or so earlier. Sometimes they were making up a brand new rule. Now, one motive for this kind of prescriptivism was national linguistic unity. The United States is enormous, and it's got a wide variety of cultures that have poured into it, developed in it. And we have a lot of linguistic variety, probably not as much as we would have had if there hadn't been this kind of freezing effect of this is what correct English is. Nonetheless, we've still got heaps of variety. As one example of how some of these rules sometimes flew in the face of actual usage or good sense, the rule against using they as a singular person of unspecified gender, that was done commonly by Shakespeare, by Chaucer, all the way back to, we're talking 15th century here. It was normal and common to use they as a singular pronoun when you weren't sure of the gender of somebody. Then suddenly we came up with this rule that was wrong, which is pretty funny, and people still rely on that today when really that just serves to exclude people who individually don't have a specified gender or prefer not to specify their gender. So I've got a nice little example here. The singular they is actually older than the singular use of you. You used to be only a plural pronoun, with thou being the singular form. So here's a little bit of writing from 1659. Again, the corrupt and unsound form of speaking in the plural number to a single person, you to one instead of thou, contrary to the pure, plain, and single language of truth, thou to one and you to more than one, which had always been used by God to men and men to God, as well as one to another, from the oldest record of time, till corrupt men for corrupt ends, in later and corrupt times, to flatter, fawn, and work upon the corrupt nature in men, brought in that false and senseless way of speaking, you to one, which hath since corrupted the modern languages, and hath greatly debased the spirits, and depraved the manners of men. This evil custom I had been as forward in as others, and this I was now called out of, and required to cease from. All right, well, that's a little hysterical. In more than one sense. But we can see the absurdity of this because at this point, of course, we've been using you for centuries as a singular pronoun. And I just want people to understand the same is true for they. We had a rule come in for a bit that you weren't supposed to, but it was not a long-standing traditional rule. It was a newly invented rule. And it was undoing common usage. We also, obviously, we know that English has not been spoken unto the depths of time. It has been spoken for 1,000 years or so. This is not the same thing. And not believing in God, I guess, helps with some of the understanding the history here. But don't think that these grammatical rules are as long-standing as they're presented as. They are often just made up out of whole cloth or out of Latin, and they don't have anything to do with historical use in English. And even if they did, language changes. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how prescriptive linguistics, or linguistic prescriptivism more accurately, affects people in the real world. Because when we say, oh, you're speaking bad English, to somebody who is in fact speaking a different dialect of English than what has been anointed as the standard of English, we're speaking out of ignorance. We are devaluing someone's communication, someone's education, someone's intelligence, purely because we are ignorant of their language. If I hear someone say I'm teaching a math class and my students keep having misunderstandings about math, Okay, so this happened to a white math and science teacher who wrote a book in 1987 called Twice as Less. She noticed that her inner city Black students were making consistent types of errors that were really puzzling her. And these students were not stupid, and she was teaching them the same way she had taught white students, and somehow they were getting really strange results, really strange understandings. Well, she did a deep dive into this, noticing that there were differences in how they were using words. And it wasn't the obvious vocabulary that we think of nouns and verbs. No, it was things like prepositions, comparatives. They were using words like than and as differently. So when she told them this is twice as much and this is half as much, they were not understanding what she meant. They would come out with phrases like twice as less. And she'd go, my head's exploding. What does that mean? Now, they had consistent usage of it, but when they heard what she said, it didn't make sense. And when she heard what they said, it didn't make sense. So in order to teach these students, you can't just tell them they're saying it wrong. You have to understand what they mean by what they're saying and help them understand what you mean by what you're saying, because you're not just teaching them math, you're teaching them a new dialect to think about math in. And if you skip that step, they are not going to get it because you're speaking gibberish. The reason this becomes a really big problem is that African American vernacular English, also called Ebonics sometimes, or Black vernacular, Black English vernacular, it's had lots of names, is very similar to standard English. It's not obvious that it's, another language. It's not really another language, it's another dialect. But it is different enough grammatically to lead to some really serious misunderstandings. And these misunderstandings are not a case of that person speaking wrong. They're a case of they're speaking a different language than you thought, so you're misunderstanding what they're saying. So if you are a white person and you hear, well, okay, let me do another example here, because there are some that were really legally important. There was a Black man who was arrested and the police suspected him of a crime, and he responded with, let me find the exact quote here. I know that I didn't do it, so why don't you just give me a lawyer, dog, because this is not what's up. The police who arrested him claimed that he had not requested a lawyer and therefore he had not invoked his right to counsel, and they didn't have to stop questioning him. The law requires that they stop questioning someone who's requested a lawyer. They said he didn't ask for a lawyer. He asked for a lawyer dog, which is an obvious absurdity. Okay, that is a perversion of understanding language, because it's very obvious that someone says, why don't you just give me a lawyer dog? He's not asking for a lawyer dog. He's asking for a lawyer dog, dude, my man, buddy. So sometimes misunderstandings can be excuses for treating someone unjustly. There used to be literacy tests given before you could vote. And of course, these literacy tests were really only given to Black people or immigrants, because white people who'd been in the US for generations were the ones that the powers that be wanted voting. So they'd really only be invoked if your grandfather or your great-grandfather hadn't voted, which of course keeps the powers that be in power. Because if your parents were slaves, this is brand new, of course your grandfather didn't vote. Or if your parents just got here from Poland, of course you haven't voted for generations. So they'd give these very, very hard tests that were really confusing and say, oh, these people don't know how to read or write English, so of course they can't vote. They're ignorant and they don't know. So these things can be used as excuses to treat someone unjustly. Here are a few more examples of how African American vernacular English are structurally, grammatically different from standard English. If a speaker of African American vernacular, and by the way, not all Black people speak African American vernacular, and not all speakers of African American vernacular are Black. There's lots of overlap, but if you grew up in a neighborhood where that's the dialect that's spoken, you're going to speak that. And if you didn't, you're probably not. If an African American vernacular speaker says, I've been married, that does not mean I have been married. It does not translate to the standard English sentence, I have been married. Because the standard American English sentence, I have been married, means I was married in the past, I am no longer married. I've been married with that emphasis means, oh, I've been married for a long time and I am still married. So understanding that these structures and particular uses of the verb be are meaning carrying and not errors will lead to not dismissing communication that is in non-standard English and not missing meaning that is being carried. Now, you may not be able to learn all the dialects that are out there, but you should be aware that they are different dialects, not just people making mistakes. Another example of grammar in African American vernacular that's different from standard English. If I say, I ain't trying to do something, like, oh, I ain't trying to have babies right now. That does not mean I am not trying to have babies. It sounds like it would translate to the standard English sentence, I'm not trying to have babies, and it doesn't. It actually is more like, I intend not to have babies. That would be a really bad thing for me to do right now. I reject the idea of having babies. So I ain't trying to is actually a much stronger statement than I'm not trying to. It's, I don't want to do that. I want not to do that. I'm doing everything I can not to. If you are curious about some of the differences between African American vernacular and standard English, if this is like new and you're like, wow, I had no idea there was all this depth to it, the Wikipedia entry on African American vernacular is actually a pretty good start. It lays out a bunch of phonological differences and grammatical differences. And there are lots of books out there. I recommend Twice as Less if you're interested in how it affects education in particular. If you're a teacher, you should read this book. There's also a video that Jack shared with me about African American vernacular. And maybe when the talk is over, Jack, you could pop that into the chat, or I can. So I've talked mostly about African American vernacular here. There are lots of other dialects that are also disprivileged compared to standard English. If you speak Ozark English, or if you speak Cajun, or if you are from Southern California and you talk like a surfer, you may not be taken seriously because you're not speaking the approved, most privileged version of English in our country. And so most people who speak a non-standard dialect of English will learn to, at least to some extent, code switch. And that means they learn standard English and they switch into it when they need to be in a job interview or, you know, talk to the landlord or something. And then they'll switch back to their native dialect when they're with their family and their friends. And that is a huge advantage, to be able to be bidialectal like that and switch registers. People who don't learn to do that are going to be stuck with that disrespect that the dispreferred dialect gets all the time. That's not fair, but that is kind of how our world is set up right now. So if you're talking to somebody who is speaking some dialect other than English, chances are they already know language better than you do if you are only a speaker of standard English, because they're more flexible and they've learned how to use two dialects or more. So don't think poorly of someone who is using a Black form of English or a British form of English that they learned in Indian schools, or has a Southern accent. These things are not bad English. These are just varieties that maybe you didn't grow up with, but they are forms of English that are utterly valid, and they just vary from the standard. So are there some ways that it is okay to be picky about language? If we end up kind of being racist or xenophobic, if we go, oh, no, you're speaking English wrong, are there times when it's okay to correct or to want conformity in our English? There are some valid reasons to want to do that. It really helps to have consistency of style and consistency of communication. If you're publishing a newspaper or magazine, you want everybody to be speaking the same language in your pages and to use the same kind of format for punctuation and things like that. That's fine, that's valid. If you're the editor, you get to decide which form of language is spoken in your pages. But people are still going to push against that. The linguist and science fiction writer Suzette Hayden Elgin published several academic papers in Ozark English because she pushed really hard against the whole idea of standard English. And people didn't like it that she published in Ozark and sounded like some kind of Appalachian hick because she was an Appalachian hick. But she also was highly educated and informed about linguistics. And she wanted to show this language is just as usable for this as the standard dialect is. Another reason that you might want to have a standard language and insist on it in certain places and times is clarity of meaning, especially for scientific or technical writing. For instance, scientists across the world have agreed to use Latin names, consistent Latin names for organisms rather than using the common names, because the common names vary from place to place, they overlap, they're contradictory. So if we all just go, okay, we're just going to call this creature this Latin name, then we know what we're talking about. So sometimes you need to do that. You need to say, no, this is the vocabulary we're using. This is how the verb forms work. We also can go, hey, I don't want that distinction to disappear. I really like the distinction between less and fewer. And if less means both, then I can't tell whether you're meaning there will be fewer taxes in the future or my taxes will actually be lower. So don't take that distinction away from me. I'm going to hang on to it. You'll pry it out of my cold, dead hands. You can't have my Oxford comma. It's okay to say, I want to preserve this distinction. But if you start saying somebody who doesn't use this distinction is ignorant, you're straying into territory that leads right into the arms of racists and classists. So don't step out of your lane, basically. If you like that usage, great. You can insist on it. You can teach it to your students. You can say, look how useful this is. But don't start saying people who do this are ignorant, or I'm not going to listen to this person because they don't have an Oxford comma. That's absurd. So I've only really touched on this topic. There's lots and lots out there. But I hope that for some of you, this has kind of opened up the idea that correcting language can create some pitfalls that can lead to harm. And we want to be careful how we're stepping on that, what our motivation actually is. So the big point I want you to carry away here is that if you are making corrections, first of all, do you need to? You want to make sure that if you make corrections, it is to help someone be heard, to make sure that you've understood them and that they are getting their message out effectively. And if they don't want your help, don't give it. What you don't want to be doing is putting someone in their place by saying, oh, you got that spelling wrong. You used that verb form wrong. Obviously, we shouldn't listen to you. That is an abuse of language. Don't do it. And as a final point, while we're on the topic of correct language and who gets to set the standard, because that is important, the capital of Ukraine is sometimes called Kiev. That is the Russian name. So if you're hearing it called Kiev, that is what the Russians decided to call it. And we probably don't want to support that. They don't get to set what it gets called. Ukrainians call it something close to Kyiv. And if you can't handle that vowel, which I'm probably not even getting right, it's okay to call it Kiev or even Kyiv. It's going to be closer to the Ukrainian pronunciation. So let people talk the way they talk. Be aware that there are differences in dialect, and if you must privilege one dialect over another, do it for consistency, not consistency and clarity, not for a hierarchy of race, national origin, class, etc. Thank you.
Okay, can we unmute and give Eva a good round of applause?